In the wild reaches of the Carpathians, where the forests were so thick that sunlight barely kissed the forest floor, a child was born. One who would one day stare into the face of the inhuman and not blink. He was the second son of Vlad Dracul, a Wallachian prince caught in the iron jaws of two devouring empires, Christian Europe to the west and the ever-growing shadow of the Ottoman East. The boy's name was Vlad. He was only 11 years old when his father handed him over as a diplomatic hostage to Sultan Murad II. It wasn't a decision, it was a sacrifice. Vlad's story doesn't begin with blood and battles. It begins in silence. The silence of a boy torn from his mother's arms, forced to march into a foreign land, a place that spoke a different language, worshipped a different god, and stripped him of ownership over his own life. To the Ottoman Empire, Vlad was nothing more than currency, collateral for a father's promise to remain loyal to the Turks. But to Vlad, this was not the end of childhood. It was the beginning of a transformation. The Ottoman palace was no place for tenderness. Vlad and his brother Radu were trapped in a golden cage, surrounded by marble halls, fragrant incense, music, and mosaics, but always watched, always studied, never free. They were taught Arabic, Turkish, mathematics, theology, and the brutal art of war. They were instructed in poetry, in strategy, in absolute obedience. But this education wasn't a gift. It was control dressed in silk. Every kind gesture hit a hook, every soft word a blade. The Ottomans weren't raising princes. They were forging human weapons. But Vlad wasn't like his brother. While Radu adapted, growing charming, graceful, and even winning the favor of the young Mehmed, destined to be the future conqueror of Constantinople, Vlad resisted. He watched, he remembered, and deep inside, he nurtured a cold hatred that fermented like poison in his veins. He trusted no one. Every beating, every insult, every punishment carved a scar into his memory, and something began to shift in the boy's soul. The Christian faith he'd been taught as a child grew distant. God had not saved him. His father had betrayed him. His homeland had forgotten him. All he had left was himself. Historical records offer only fragments of those years, but whispers remain of dark cells, violent beatings, endless isolation, and the oppressive presence of guards. Vlad had no freedom, but he had eyes, and what he saw in the Ottoman court marked him forever. He saw public executions, heard the screams of the enslaved, smelled dried blood in palace courtyards. The Ottomans didn't hide violence. They turned it into spectacle, into power. Their cruelty wasn't the exception, it was policy. And Vlad was taking notes. But it wasn't only terror. There was training. Like the Janissaries, Ottoman warrior elites taken as children, Vlad was molded into a fighter. He learned to wield a sword, ride horses, shoot arrows, and strike with daggers. He studied how to command armies, how to speak with icy calculation, how to manipulate with surgical precision. They hoped to make him a loyal servant of the empire. Instead, they made him something else. They taught him ruthlessness, and Vlad learned well. But the most dangerous change wasn't what was done to him. It was what awakened inside. He began to split in two. On the outside, he nodded, smiled, obeyed. On the inside, he forged a secret identity. He began to admire the Ottomans' architecture of fear, their worship of power, their precision and discipline. He realized that to rule being just wasn't enough. You had to be feared. Terror, he learned, could be more powerful than compassion. Death wasn't just punishment. It could be message, symbol, and strategy. while Radu bloomed under the Sultan's care, embracing their language, their culture, and even forming an intimate bond with young Mehmed, Vlad felt betrayed. To him, Radu wasn't just a brother. He was a traitor to their blood, to their God, to their heritage. Vlad hardened, day by day, like a stone baked in fire, and on those quiet nights, locked in his lonely cell, he dreamed of Wallachia, of returning home, of reclaiming his name, his throne, his pride. But he wouldn't return as a victim. He would return as something new, something the Ottomans had created without realizing it, a man capable of inspiring a fear even greater than what had once consumed him. The boy had died. In his place, a far more dangerous being was being born. But time hadn't yet finished its work. There were still betrayals ahead, more scars, more losses. What remained was the final spark that would turn Vlad into more than a prince, a blood-stained legend. His reign was still far off, but already his soul burned with the warning signs of a coming storm. And when he finally left the Ottoman palace, it wouldn't be as a freed man. It would be as a sharpened blade, forged in captivity, ready to rip apart everything that had once chained him. When Vlad crossed the threshold of the Ottoman Empire for the last time, he carried no treasure, no army. But he brought something far more devastating, a new understanding of power. He had seen how empires were built, not with hope, but with horror. He knew now. Mercy inspired no loyalty. Law without punishment was a joke. The love of a people could fade, but terror endured for generations. That was his secret inheritance. Not a religion, not a homeland, but a formula. The world he returned to was not the same. Wallachia, his homeland, was little more than a pawn caught between kingdoms. Hungary loomed to the west. The Ottomans pressed in from the east. His father, Vlad Dracul, had been murdered by treacherous Wallachian nobles, the boyars, a class of aristocrats who changed loyalty like others changed cloaks. His older brother, Mircea, had been blinded and buried alive. His bloodline was in disgrace. His claim to the throne? Weak. But Vlad hadn't come back to ask permission. He came back to take what was his. There was no parade waiting, no warm welcomes, just suspicious eyes, hushed whispers, and the chill of enemies in every corner. And it was in that climate of tension that Vlad understood. He wouldn't rise through peace. He needed allies. But more importantly, he needed to show he wasn't some lost boy. He began to unveil his new identity. Cold eyes, a quiet voice. He walked the halls of Wallachian courts, watching, studying faces, recalling past betrayals. He didn't seek revenge. Not yet. He planned. His early years back were a dance in the dark. He made temporary pacts with Hungary, seduced smaller factions, swore allegiance to Christianity with his mouth, while his heart beat with nothing but calculation. His first test came in the form of the throne itself. To claim it, he had to remove a puppet king placed there by the Ottomans. And he did it not through glorious battles, but through cunning, veiled threats and surgical moves. Bit by bit, he reshaped his name into something unavoidable. He didn't request respect, he demanded it. And when he was finally crowned voivode, Prince of Wallachia, he didn't celebrate. Because for Vlad, the crown wasn't the reward, it was the beginning. Everything from now on was preparation for war. The Wallachia Vlad inherited was in ruins. Peasants were starving. The nobility was rotting with corruption. The cities were weak, and the military barely a shadow of strength. But Vlad didn't see rubble. He saw potential, and he ruled with an iron fist. He hung corrupt tax collectors, demanded fair tribute, slashed the bloated privileges of the boyars, the same traitorous nobles who had murdered his father. He outlawed theft, bribery, and treason with one clear price: death. Status didn't matter. Bloodline didn't matter. In Vlad's Wallachia, no one stood above terror, and it was then, amidst this brutal reshaping of power, that the symbol which would make him immortal began to emerge: impalement. It wasn't a new method. The Ottomans had used it before, but Vlad transformed it into something else entirely. It became more than a punishment. It became a message, a warning, a macabre form of art. Bodies on stakes rose like grim sculptures at city gates, along the roads, across open fields, entire forests of human suffering. And Vlad watched them, silent and unmoved, because he understood one thing better than anyone: a terrified people would obey, and a terrified enemy would think twice before marching forward. But soon, the complaints began. Hungarian nobles, papal envoys, Saxon merchants, all whispered the same thing. The Prince of Wallachia had become a monster. And yet, Vlad didn't answer with words. He answered with results. Crime dropped to near zero. People said you could leave a bag of gold in the middle of the street, and no one would dare touch it. There were even stories that Vlad left golden cups at public fountains, untouched for weeks, just to prove his control. He had brought absolute order, alone. But outside his borders, shadows grew. Rumors spread across Europe. Stories that he impaled children, boiled traitors, nailed the turbans of Turkish envoys to their skulls when they refused to remove them in his presence. Some were exaggerations, some were true. But truth didn't matter. What mattered was belief. Vlad was crafting a legend just as carefully as he crafted his laws. He didn't need a grand court. He didn't need a massive army. He only needed everyone to think of him as the line between life and death. And the Ottomans were watching. They remembered the boy they had once imprisoned, the boy they had hoped to control. Now he ruled a critical territory and refused to kneel. He stopped paying tribute. He mocked the Sultan's emissaries. And most dangerously, he launched raids across the Danube into Ottoman land. He didn't sneak in like a bandit. He crossed the river like a statement. He burned villages, wiped out garrisons, left fields soaked in blood. It was a message: I am not afraid. And so, the inevitable happened. Mehmed II, the man who had conquered Constantinople, the Sultan of a swelling empire, had had enough. He began to prepare an invasion, not a skirmish, not a warning, an annihilation. Tens of thousands of troops, heavy artillery, cavalry, elite Janissary units. A monstrous force with one goal: erase Vlad from the map. Replace him with Radu, his own brother, now loyal to the empire. But Mehmed didn't know he wasn't marching into a traditional war. He was walking into a nightmare. Vlad had seen this coming. He knew Mehmed. He knew war. And most of all, he knew fear. He didn't wait behind castle walls. He didn't build fortresses. He prepared a battlefield of silence and shadows. He ordered entire villages evacuated, emptied cities, poisoned wells, contaminated food supplies, and lining the road ahead, he left his signature: bodies on stakes, hundreds, then thousands. Each corpse told a story: a thief, a deserter, a traitor, a captured Turk. Their rotting flesh blistered under the sun, their sockets pecked out by crows, their tongues dangling from their jaws. They stood like grotesque trees, sentinels of a land ruled not by man, but by terror incarnate. And Mehmed's army marched deeper. He couldn't turn back. But every step forward made the journey worse. The summer heat was suffocating. Food ran low, water turned foul, horses died, soldiers cracked, and then the whispers began. Of patrols that vanished, of screams in the night, moaning, whispering, sobbing from somewhere deep in the woods. This wasn't a campaign anymore. It was a descent into madness. Then came June, a blistering night near the capital, Târgoviște. Mehmed set up camp. He expected a battle the next day. Instead, at dawn, he saw what history would name the Forest of the Impaled. More than 20,000 corpses, men, women, children, horses, soldiers, pierced on massive wooden stakes, arranged in terrifying geometric patterns, stretching as far as the eye could see. Some bodies still twitched. Others were nothing but bone. The stench was overwhelming. The silence, paralyzing. Even the hardened janissaries couldn't look for long. Mehmed himself, according to chroniclers, turned pale. For the first time, the conqueror of cities stood before something he didn't understand. This wasn't defense, it was declaration. Vlad didn't fight like a man. He fought like something forged in hell. And still, he wasn't done. That night, as the Ottoman soldiers tried to rest under the oppressive sky, Vlad struck, not with an army, but with a few thousand warriors who knew the forest like their own blood. They didn't attack from the front. They slipped into tents, slit throats, set fires, screamed from the shadows. Panic tore through the camp. Soldiers trampled each other, killed each other in confusion, screamed for help that never came. Mehmed barely escaped with his life. By sunrise, the battlefield was covered in ash, blood, and fear. And Vlad? Gone. Vanished into the woods. The great Ottoman invasion had collapsed, not by strength, but by psychological destruction. Mehmed retreated, not defeated in war, but in will. His men had no desire to fight a ghost, no stomach to be impaled alive, no strategy against a phantom who used terror as both sword and shield. Vlad had won, but victory came at a price. His methods were effective, but earned him no friends. European kings watched with unease. The Pope praised his resistance against the infidels, but whispered uneasily of his brutality. Even Hungary, once an ally, began to view him as a threat. And back home, the boyars never forgave him for stripping their power. He ruled with an iron grip. But each day, he stood more alone. And in the distance, a figure approached. A rival cloaked not in armor but in charm. Radu, his own brother. Handsome, elegant, Ottoman general, the perfect counter to Vlad. Where Vlad terrified, Radu promised peace. Where Vlad impaled, Radu negotiated. And Mehmed, always clever, knew that sometimes a throne is won not by war, but by offering calm after the storm. Backed by Ottoman support, Radu marched on Wallachia. Many nobles, weary of terror, defected. The people, exhausted by fear, began to doubt. And Vlad, though still feared, was no longer invincible. He fled into Transylvania, seeking refuge with King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. But there was no rescue. There was betrayal. Instead of sanctuary, Vlad was imprisoned. Yes, Vlad the Impaler. The man who had broken the Ottomans, ruled with unmatched control, instilled fear across kingdoms, was now a prisoner, caged by those who once called him ally. The Hungarian court, under pressure from German merchants and European politics, abandoned him. They said he was mad, that he drank blood, that he had made a pact with the devil. No one wanted the weight of defending him, and so, the man who once terrified an empire faded into a foreign cell, forgotten by friends, despised by enemies. But Vlad wasn't gone. He was waiting. Because monsters don't die in dungeons, they sleep, Years slipped by while Vlad sat in chains, but outside his cell, Wallachia was still a kingdom under siege, its future balanced on a knife's edge. The Ottomans kept Radu on the throne, ruling as a puppet to ensure the region stayed firmly under their control. But politics, especially in Europe, are as fickle as shadows at dusk. Alliances shifted, threats changed shape, and whispers of Vlad, of blood, never really went away. To some, he was still a symbol of unbending resistance, a prince who bowed to no empire. To others, he was the very image of cruelty, a man whose brutality eclipsed all sense of reason. But to Vlad himself, their opinions meant nothing. There was only one obsession left in him: to return home, to rule again, to impose an order that only he could imagine. And in 1475, his moment came. Tense negotiations and political pressure finally secured his release. Vlad was free once more, and when he returned to Wallachia, the people watched with conflicted eyes, some with fear, others with hope. They remembered the terror, but they also remembered the peace he brought with it. But the war was far from over. The Ottoman Empire still lurked, and Radu, now firmly embedded in their web, remained a threat. This time, however, Vlad returned not just as a survivor, but as something sharper, more calculated. Hardened by imprisonment, fueled by vengeance, driven by justice soaked in blood. His second reign was a continuation of the first, but now there was no room for hesitation. He reinforced castles, rebuilt fortresses, rearmed his soldiers. He re-established ties with Hungary and other Christian powers, who now viewed him as a wall against the Ottoman tide. But inside the kingdom, the rot had returned. The boyars, the same nobles he had once crushed, still whispered in the shadows, resentful, afraid. They never forgave him for cutting their power to the bone. To them, Vlad was no protector. He was a tyrant. They longed for the quiet compliance of Radu and the Ottoman order, rather than Vlad's iron grip. And they weren't alone. Enemies circled like wolves. Radu and Mehmed joined forces once again, determined to rip Vlad from power for good. What followed wasn't an open war, but a campaign fought in ambushes, lies, and sabotage, a civil war disguised in diplomacy. Through it all, Vlad didn't break. His legend as the Impaler only grew, fueled both by his ruthless tactics and the propaganda of those who feared him. And yet, beneath that monstrous image was a man who understood the true price of power: loneliness, betrayal, and sacrifice. He fought on, victory after victory, and with each win, the bodies piled higher. Each impalement sent a clear message: challenge me and suffer. But the cost was immense. Years of war had drained his forces. Trust was rare. Allies were thin. The mighty prince who once ruled with unquestioned authority now stood in a kingdom cracking beneath the weight of conflict. He had become a storm within his own walls, and that storm was nearing its end. The twilight of Vlad's reign came wrapped in daggers and deceit. For over a decade, he had ruled with fire, crushing corruption, burning away rebellion. His enemies called him cruel, but he called it survival. Wallachia was a fragile land, crushed between Ottoman hunger and internal decay. Vlad believed that only fear could preserve it, that only absolute authority could hold the vultures at bay. But fear is a double-edged sword. The same boyars he'd once terrified now plotted in secret. They saw their status diminished, their privileges erased, and worse, they saw an opening. Beyond Wallachia, Mehmed II, still brooding over Vlad's past defiance, saw the region as unfinished business. He had never forgiven Vlad's bold raids, his slaughter of Ottoman troops, or the humiliation of his failed invasion. And this time, he would not leave things to chance. Radu, ever the loyal puppet, led Ottoman-backed forces toward the capital once more. The boyars, eager for revenge and restoration, opened their gates. Vlad fought back with all he had left. His fury had not faded. His grip, though weaker, was still deadly. Warriors still followed him, not just out of loyalty, but out of reverence, fear, and the legacy he carved with steel and fire. But strength alone couldn't save him. He was outnumbered, betrayed from within. And slowly, relentlessly, the tide turned. The battles grew bloodier, wearier, trust crumbled, and at last, the prince who once ruled with godlike fear fell, captured, or perhaps slain. No one knows for certain. Some say Vlad died in battle, sword in hand. Others whisper he was betrayed and executed in secret. Some even claim he was left to rot in a cell once more. But what's clear is this: his body was never found. His political presence vanished. And yet, his legacy never did. Vlad the Impaler became more than a ruler, more than a tyrant. He became a myth, a symbol. To some, he was the last wall against foreign domination. To others, a monster forged by torture and vengeance. A ruler who used terror like a sculptor uses stone, shaping order through dread. And over time, that myth grew claws. Exaggerated tales and chilling stories spilled across Europe. That he drank blood, that he dined among the dying, that his cruelty went beyond human. And in the 19th century, one writer gave that myth eternal life: Bram Stoker. He took pieces of Vlad's legend, his name, his cruelty, his fearsome legacy, and crafted Count Dracula, a niche icon that would haunt culture forever. The vampire with noble blood and a thirst for power, an eternal predator drawn from the shadow of a man who once ruled Wallachia with unblinking terror. But behind the fangs and fiction lies a far more haunting truth. Vlad was real, a man shaped by loss, captivity, betrayal, and war. A boy stripped of innocence and transformed into a ruler who believed the only way to preserve order was to wield fear like a weapon. His story is not just one of horror, but of questions we still wrestle with today. How far can power go before it becomes tyranny? When does justice become cruelty? What price must be paid to defend a nation crumbling from within? Vlad the Impaler teaches us that power, unchecked, doesn't just rule, it consumes. That survival, when tangled with vengeance, can give birth to monsters, and that the line between protector and predator is often drawn in blood. Centuries have passed, but his name still echoes through castles, books, and legends. He is remembered not just because he ruled, but because he terrified. Because he showed us that monsters don't always come from nightmares. Sometimes they come from history.